answer to what is accelerationism reference in the context of politics. And finally, we'll present some thoughts on how technological models can facilitate this accelerationism. So at the heart of accelerationism lies the moment of being, constructing freedom in ever greater measures. Common to the project of a modern system of knowledge, Cosmos visions of the future, and post-capitalist economic planning is the goal of establishing the conditions for freedom. But freedom here must be contrasted with any naturalized or imminent vision of freedom, stemming from some unique attribute of the human condition. Freedom instead is the binding of oneself to a rational rule and adherence to it. As Ray Brasio puts it, the postmodern assault on rationality generates a climate in which impulse masquerades as freedom. But of course, all our impulses are conditioned, controlled, and increasingly manufactured, so that ultimately only the ability to regulate conceptually generated impulses can block the tyranny of impulsiveness. Freedom is a cultural achievement, not a biological birthright. It is conceptual compulsion supplanting biological compulsion. End quote. There are two essential aspects of freedom to distinguish here. One is the binding of ourselves to an expanding set of rational commitments, and the other is the extension of capacities to transform necessities into malleable material. The former is the traditional Enlightenment project, writ large with its ultimately universalist and inhuman trajectories. It's the liberation from imminent desires and urges and the construction of a system of normative rational knowledge. It finds its expression in epistemic accelerationism, whether inspired by Longo or by Brandon. The second aspect of freedom is an unashamedly Promethean enterprise. It's the creation of social, economic, political, and technological systems which expand their capacities and make it possible for rational thought to become effective in the world. The focus in this paper is on the second aspect, and the argument will be that it can be filtered through the first aspect. So the overall acceleration scheme must therefore be picked out as, in Benedict Singleton's words, a generalized escapology, an unrelenting project to unbind the necessities of this world and transform them into materials for further constructing freedom. So the first task of accelerationism are epistemic ones of synthesis, expansion, and creation. Against reductive projects which overlook the creative capacities of knowledge, that is to say, logics of justification over logics of discovery, epistemic accelerationism seeks to expand rational thought in every direction. In this vein, the recent interest surrounding mathematics, physics, and biology concerns how some of the most successful sciences have organized and produced knowledge and practice. For instance, whereas analytic philosophy of mathematics is aimed to create hierarchies of mathematics, in practice, mathematicians have produced bridges, mixtures, and synthesis of various fields, forming unity in diversity. Part of the wager of this paper is that the sort of epistemic accelerationism that Negro-Stani has been developing in the fields of mathematics, physics, and biology can also be applied to economic science. Knowledge in this vision is to put Giuseppe Longo, a network which supports itself by a reflecting equilibrium of conjectures and theories by the exchanges and enrichments between essentially different approaches. This is its unity. The second set of tasks for accelerationism entails reconfiguring the material world in accordance with the drive to expand capacities for action. So as the Russian cosmist Nikolai Fedorov put it in the early 20th century, regulation, the control of the blind force of nature, can and must become the great task common to us all. Political accelerationism is therefore oriented towards unbinding the constraints of particular economic and political systems. This is a relative gesture, meaning, for instance, that with feudalism, capitalism was accelerationist. Similarly, contemporary accelerationism must be aimed at undermining the constraints of the present capitalist order. This paper aims to show that epistemic accelerationism, in fact, assists political accelerationism, a point Louis Althusser hints at when he writes, "Just as knowledge of the laws of life has never prevented men from seeing, so knowledge of the laws that govern the development of societies does not prevent men from living. On the contrary, knowledge of the laws of life has produced the glasses which have transformed men's sight, just as knowledge of the laws of social development has given rise to endeavors which have transformed and enlarged the horizon of human existence." So in light of this, the development of economic science presents itself as one of the primary conduits between epistemic and political accelerationism, particularly the economic models, which condense scientific memory into an embodied technological form. It is in models that the developmental process of economic science can be solidified, as well as where the weaponizing of speculation can occur. An analytical, though not ontological, distinction can be drawn here between On the one hand, models that provide navigation and strategic tools for the current system, and on the other hand, models that provide conceptions for a future capitalist society, post-capitalist society. The longer version of this paper takes each of these models in turn, demonstrating that the epistemic accelerationism of these models parallels the political accelerationism of post-capitalist movements. The first set of models directly counters the existing economic science of neoclassical economics. Whereas neoclassical economic models provide the scientific legitimation of the current system, the development of these models can also provide the necessary tool for making global capitalism cognitively tractable. The complexity of the present order is such that it evades any cognitive mapping and requires the model in order to orient ourselves in the current conjunction. Models are therefore needed, in part, to mitigate the worst excesses of the current system, while striving to recognize the long-term limits of capitalist accumulation. Proposals such as quantitative easing for the masses are not intuitive unless one has a thoroughly developed model of how money, financing, private credit, and interest rates work in a modern fiat economy. The same holds for token tax proposals, being premised on a knowledge of financial infrastructure, offshore accounts, and securities regulations. I won't discuss navigational models in detail here, in no small part because it's technical and likely of interest to only a handful of people. Suffice it to say, in the full version of this paper, this section aims to show how the epistemic aims of accelerationism can be applied to neoclassical models. What does one end up with here? The realization that the shift from linear to nonlinear equations, the shift from deterministic to probabilistic variables, and the shift from equilibrium to disequilibrium economics are all fundamentally arguments against two things. On an epistemic level, against neoclassical modeling, and on a political level, against a free market economy. The critique of restricted knowledge therefore parallels the critique of restricted economies. From this realization, the aim of epistemic accelerationism in economic science must be to attain a number of qualities of modern knowledge. So in particular, this means developing a model which could map the transition from capitalist to post-capitalist economies. The model would have to be more general than most specific instantiations. So Graham Jonkos alluringly puts it at one point. Different economic methodologies, Marxian, Austrian, etc., can all be viewed as different geometries. In effect, each economic methodology posits and describes a fundamentally different kind of economy. So rather than taking Keynes's reductionist view that certain economics are each Euclidean geometry in a non-Euclidean world, we can follow the idea instead that the economy is not a homogeneous entity, but rather just as different surfaces, flat, round, hyperbolic, fractal, exist in the real world, there are also different economic surfaces subsumed within what we call the economy. So each economic theory therefore provides a particular geometry of a proper economic science. From here, economic science is starting to become a generalized meta-economics, wherein which particular economic theories are merely local instantiations conditioned by fundamental presuppositions about value, exchange, distribution, and social forces. It requires establishing the invariance of economics beyond different economies, beyond the particular variables of capitalist economies such as private property, commodified labor, and accumulative capital. New models are also needed for understanding what any system beyond capitalism might look like. Here, historical inspiration comes from both Soviet experiments in economic planning, as well as the more innovative Chilean experiments. In both cases, there was a synthesis of local global interactions in the form of modeling an economy presented in situation rooms, and a synthesis of epistemic and political accelerationism, so employing optimization algorithms and economic models combined with proto-internet experiments in data communication. The metaphoric, or sometimes literal, image of the situation room therefore indexes these two syntheses, solving the need to translate complexity into interfaces, the need for actionable representations, and the need to use technology in order to develop humanity's Promethean tendencies. Central to any such project of post-capitalism is the idea of control rooms. So centers of calculation which mediate between local phenomenology and global structures in order to render a complex system amenable to modulation and action. The classical form of the control room finds its paradigmatic example in the war room, products of that moment where existential threat compels capitalist economies to shirk their liberal pretenses and adopt a thorough system of economic planning. The links between centralized economies and war are so close that it is no surprise to learn that God's plan in the Soviet Union was inspired and modeled after Germany's World War I economic system. In these classical models, often constructed by designers and architects, emerges a system of top-down, highly centralized control, with orders emanating from the top and acted upon by below. And it is precisely these types of control rooms which are ineffective and made obsolete after the failures of really existing common room. New situation rooms are slide off the traditional pretenses towards full control and instead attempt to modular flows. Traffic control rooms in global cities, border management in politically sensitive areas, and placing in major metropolitan areas are all examples of this. In this regard, the Chilean experiment with CyberSyn formed one of the key experiments to learn from. Precisely because it incorporates worker autonomy and worker control over the factories into a decentralized planning system, CyberSyn tears apart ancient ideas of Soviet Gosplan with its impersonal and tedious bureaucracy. The critique of economic modeling has a role to play here as well, as the CyberSyn control room included a simulator of the Chilean economy. While a relatively simple model of the national economy at the time, the principle behind it still holds today. Notably, epistemic accelerationism of economic science and political accelerationism of post-capitalist planning. So with today's computing power, the simulator can not only be greatly expanded, but it can also run multiple possible outcomes in order to determine the best possible outcome. Whereas the real economy today, running on a price system of information, can only run one outcome at a time. The virtual economies and simulators can choose which path through phase space an economy would be best suited for. Lastly, from the notion of political accelerationism, we can start to derive particular components of a properly post-capitalist order. From the rational side of accelerationism and the normative nature of freedom, we can derive the necessity for collective self-mastery and the need for new forms of democracy. Similar derivations occur in the economic sphere. Matthias Krull, in a recent critique of market socialism, argues that central planning is fundamentally oriented towards the reduction of working hours. While this is necessarily one goal of any sort of post-capitalist society, the other goal must be the active construction of freedom. To remain solely at the level of reducing working hours, and to remain bound to a thin idea of freedom that conceives of it as natural and merely hidden behind present social constraints. The thicker meaning of freedom, the more substantial meaning of freedom, goes beyond this. It requires using reason and technology in order to construct socio-technical systems which generate new affordances and which transform necessities into means. Here, political accelerationism meets up with cosmic inclinations. To conclude then, weaponizing speculation in this context entails, on the one hand, universalizing the restrictive models of contemporary economic science and developing navigational tools for unbinding constraints of capitalism. On the other hand, speculation on the future, and in particular the construction of an economic model, also provides an attractor around which a movement can mobilize, and a plan for how to liberate human potentials that already exist. Thank you.
I suppose we'll applaud him in part. Okay, setting this up. So again, we're going to have questions after the talk. Oh, it's all going off fine. Just as a note, I think some people said, due to the size of this room and the acoustics, if just people, when they're asking questions, just speak up a bit, or maybe just louder than you normally would speak. Oh yeah, so that's a general thing to everybody. We're going to be like, two very, very old people who are kind of deaf and having a conversation in a cafe that everyone can hear because they're screaming at each other. So next up is Dylan Trigg. I'm here. Dylan is a postdoctoral research fellow at UCD School of Philosophy. He's a researcher at Les Archives Husserl, École Normale Supérieure, working in conjunction with Dorothée Legrand, is it? Mm-hmm. Not so bad. He received his PhD from the University of Sussex with a thesis on the materiality of memory. His research includes phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and various aspects of bodily existence. He's the author of The Memory of Place, a phenomenology of the uncanny, which rave reviews. I think it's like... I like making him awkward.
You do so well.
The Aesthetics of Decay, Nothingness, Nostalgia, and the Absence of Reason. And The Thing, I'm forthcoming with 0 books, The Thing, Xenophenomenology, and The Origin of Life. Just a kind of a note, you're not going to hear much about phenomenology is going to be mentioned in a somewhat pejorative sense in a lot of these circles, but Dylan is someone who actually probably makes us have hope for phenomenology again, I think, with your work. Certainly you'll find out just why right now.
Oh, that's very kind. Thanks, I appreciate that very much. The kind introduction. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me. And yeah, as Fintan says, this actually, this paper is part of this Zero Books thinking, this project that I'm trying to put together. And one of the criticisms that I'm trying to do in this book concerns phenomenology's apparent leaning toward a human-centric account of the world, together with its veneration, or its supposed veneration, of lived experience as some guarantor of truth. And I am a self-confessed phenomenologist, card-carrying member, but I'm also critical of various tendencies in phenomenology, and not least these two tendencies towards the veneration of lived experience and this general orientation towards a particular account of human experience that seems to me it's orientated at all times towards a sort of unified account. And so I've been trying to think through some of these issues over the last few years, and now in this project that I'm working with now, aiming it more explicitly at sort of criticisms raised by speculative realism and this sort of current of thinking. So my method of trying to get beyond this limited kind of phenomenology is to centralize the materiality of the body. So the body is very, very important for me. And in my account, the human body becomes the living host for another sort of agency, and an agency which in some fundamental sense is at odds with our existing notions of phenomenology, and also at odds with our account of what it is perhaps to be a experiencing subject. So in this paper I want to outline two ways in which this kind of disturbance of phenomenology can occur precisely from within the phenomenological framework. So first, I develop an account here of the materiality of the body as being structured by a prehistory which is outside of lived experience. This non-experiential account of the body's temporality presents what I think is a challenge to traditional accounts of phenomenology as privileging a unified or coherent account of the self. And second, I argue that despite this non-experiential temporality, the body is nevertheless implicated as an indirect mode of expression for the prehistory in the form of what I describe as a sort of alien materiality. So the overall aim here is to chart the emergence of the body as this alien matter. It's a body that I want to develop as being devoid of ethical or political value, at least initially, and presented in archaeological terms as what Gaston Bachelard cites as this phrase fossilized duration, which I like very much. And so the term xenoarchaeology here, which is the title of the paper, it captures this corporeal geology which aims at all times, true to the spirit of phenomenology, to return to things in themselves. So let me begin then by posing this question: what is the body? Well, of course, the question has been asked by phenomenologists time and again, and despite the best efforts of Merleau-Ponty, who is very important to me, who's sort of my main phenomenological interlocutor, one may be forgiven for thinking that phenomenology venerates the body as a sort of atemporal entity employed to homogenize the world into a uniform state. And yet it is precisely with Merleau-Ponty that the body gains a dimension beyond its immediate temporality. So just to sort of put this in context, I just want to give a brief account here of two sort of versions of the relationship between time and the body that is presented in Merleau-Ponty. You have a duplicity. There's a duplicity that's at stake. So in the first way, Merleau-Ponty presents the body as a point of convergence for the structure of time as it's lived by the subject. And this comes under various categories, but one category would be the intentional arc. And he describes this as a life that is underpinned by an arc that, quote, projects around us our past, our future, our human world, our physical situation, our ideological situation, our moral situation, or rather that which ensures that we are situated within all of these relationships. So the point here is to take from this description is that we have a sort of sense of the body as being anchored in the immediacy of the present. Thanks indeed to the body, time coheres in a unified continuity, establishing a level of stability beyond personal experience. And yet, if you have this on the one hand, on the other hand, there is an account of the body here as possessing time that is left out and refuses to be integrated into subjectivity. So here too in the phenomenology of perception, another side of the body's temporality is revealed, which dissents from the view of time as being reductive to the structure of the finite subject. The point of departure comes in the chapter on sensing. Here Merleau-Ponty will make a shift from the singularity of the finite temporality to an atmosphere of generality presented to us in the form of an anonymous body. The issue here concerns the identity of the subject of perception. Who is perceiving? Well, Merleau-Ponty responds, quote, "Every perception takes place within an atmosphere of generality and is presented to us as anonymous. If I wanted to express my experience with precision, I would have to say that one perceives in me, not that I perceive." So this move from the particular to the general carries with it a different account of temporality that is inscribed into the body. At stake in this move is a rupture of lived time and an encroachment of a time outside of conscious experience. Understood in structural terms, the time of sensation assumes a parallel role to the pre-personal horizon of birth and death. And just as with birth and death, sensation arises from beneath myself. This is Merleau-Ponty's phrase again, beneath myself. And it will continue without me, just as my birth or my death belong to an anonymous mortality or birth. End quote. My existence, such as it finds itself in the present, then, is marked by another self. This is Merleau-Ponty, another self that has already sided with the world long before I, the personal subject, arrive onto the scene. So, let me put this in context. What we have here is a desensitized account of sensation. Sensation, as Merleau-Ponty has it, distances me from the materiality of my subjectivity. It confronts me with an anterior aspect of self that is both constitutive of the subject while also being beyond the subject. And this description of the subject as both in itself and beyond itself establishes a duplicitous structure to the body. At all times, the phenomenal subject is carried along in the world by a sedimented and impersonal history, manifest in perception, and yet irreducible to perception. The result, in Merleau-Ponty's words, is that, quote, "I never have an absolute possession of myself by myself." Beyond the sphere of personal existence, another subject intervenes in the act of perception. There, again in Merleau-Ponty's words, confirming and renewing in us a prehistory. End quote. So here the paradox of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy comes to the foreground. For him, phenomenology is recovery work of the unreflective experience of the world. At the border of the primordial realm, reflection turns to a pre-personal and pre-reflective source, and there finds, in Merleau-Ponty's well-known formulation, an original past, a past that has never been present. So, we have a sense of the body as the bearer of two orders of time. One marks the coherence of time as it's lived, the other signals the alterity of an originary past that is both constitutive of the present without ever being present. In each case, it is the body that becomes the artifact through which the depth of time can be understood. And the plan now is to give some attention to this relationship between the materiality of the body and the immemorial notion of an original past, or a past that has never been present. The key, I think, to approaching this relationship between the particularity of the body and the idea of an original past is with the notion of the trace, or the bodily trace, the corporeal trace. Of the places where this term trace appears in the phenomenology of perception, none is more crucial for the current context than where it appears in the chapter on intersubjectivity. And, quote, When I turn toward my perception itself, and when I pass from direct perception to the thought about this perception, I reenact it. I understand a thought older than I am at work in my perceptual organs, of which those organs are merely the trace. End quote. So Merleau-Ponty here is describing the moment of radical reflection, whereupon the thinking organ of the present reveals itself as a prehistoric organ of the past. With this transformation, the organs of the subject become the voice of another agency at work within myself, and yet seemingly indifferent to the host entity that it employs as a life source. So, if the personal organs resist negation in the transformation, then it is only because the same organ is reenacting a thought older than myself. This sense of the body as being structured by an agency working behind the scenes, in a sort of corporeal unconsciousness, and thus sedimented in deep time, resurfaces in his late writings on nature. And it's in these cryptic notes and fragments that we can begin to get a sense of the archaeological evolution of the body, which was only embryonic in the phenomenology. In a passage which is typical of this late style, he presents us with the following puzzle. Quote, "The body object is only a trace in the mechanical sense, a present substitute of a past that no longer is. The trace, for us, is more than the present effect of the past, it is a survival of the past. The trace in the fossil. The living thing is no longer there, but it's almost there. We have the negative of it." So if this use of trace in the earlier Merleau-Ponty referred to the structure of perception on a lived experiential scale, then in this latter use, a move is made from localized phenomena to the ontology of the body itself. Here, it is not just that perception reveals a prehistory to the subject, which is reenacted in and through perception, but that the very materiality of the body is defined, in effect, by a non-materiality. Again, the body object is only a trace. Here, Merleau-Ponty inverts the materiality of the body, revealing to us a collision of absence and presence, marked by the prehistory of the flesh. We are in direct contact with the past that no longer is, indirect because at no point does the evolution of the body detach itself from its own materiality. So, we have two ideas at stake. One is the notion of a temporality outside of lived experience, which structures the subject, while at the same time being irreducible to the subject, and in other words, the life of the personal body does not exhaust the geological or temporal depth of a prehistoric corporeality. The finitude of the human species is a particular articulation of a more generalized existence, which of course both precedes and succeeds human existence. Merleau-Ponty's account of the trace, in its relationship to both perception and the ontology of the body, renders this structure between the personal and the impersonal possible. The second idea is that the body, while being structured by a prehistory, is also thematically implicated by this history in the form of an alien life. So in this sort of xenophenomenology that I'm trying to work on, it's not only the body of the human that is structurally and thematically marked by this alien presence, it is materiality itself. The alliance between materiality and alienness, already evident in the account of the body and the fossil, establishes the context from which a phenomenological xenoarchaeology can be cultivated. Again, it is with Merleau-Ponty that the origins of this xenophenomenology can be found. Already in the phenomenology of perception, the germs have been laid for what will later become a phenomenological realism in the form of transcendental flesh. Now, this is a point that obviously needs to be argued for, but this would be just one claim. In a chapter on the natural world, we find a discussion of the nature of the thing, and after declaring in a rejoinder to the as yet unborn Meillassoux that, quote, "We have not exhausted the meaning of the thing by defining it as a correlate of our body and our life," end quote, he then goes on to discuss the obscure mass of the body. Under certain modes of perception, the familiar way in which we approach things in their human context is breached by a recognition of the non-human element. This is his quote, "the non-human element which lies hidden in all things, which," again, quote, "is unaware of us, it remains in itself." So by turning to things with a metaphysical attention, the thing reveals itself as hostile and alien, no longer an interlocutor, but a resolutely silent other. This inclusion of metaphysics in this passage signals the birth of another phenomenology, a phenomenology that moves beyond the veneration placed on lived experience and now recognizes the resistance of things that do not conform to experience. But not only is the non-human world hidden in all things, it's also alien and hostile, opposed to the human desire for dialogue with the world. Nowhere is this alien resistance clearer than in the materiality of the body, as much an organ of perception in the present as a prehistory, unknowable except as a trace left behind. To approach the phenomena of the body from the perspective of a genuine alien phenomenology, it is not enough to describe how it's lived. More than this, an archaeological orientation will be required in order to truly return to things themselves. Why? Because if the body withdraws from its own experiential boundaries, then what remains as excess matter in this non-experience has to be approached from an indirect route, namely that of xenoarchaeology. Xenoarchaeology recognizes materiality as being structured by remnants belonging to another order of time. As Merleau-Ponty has it in his late lectures on nature, quote, "It is to give this depth to the human body, this archaeology, this natal past." End quote. Phenomenology thus begins here as recovery work, at all times revolving around a geological depth that manifests itself only by accident in the phenomenal realm. A phenomenological xenoarchaeology, therefore, recognizes the anteriority of the material entity that we term the body. It is a body divested of a human form, returned to the origin, the arch, from which the contingency of life secretes into existence. Xenoarchaeology thus presupposes nothing in advance, other than there is a material entity that has emerged on the surface of a planet and which has yet to devolve or evolve into a human form. At the same time, the succession of generations does nothing to dissolve this alienage. Neither birth nor death annihilate the prehistory of the alien, but only confirm its continued renewal in and through the human body. Thanks.
Okay, any comments, supplements, questions, discussion there? Doc, I'll give you first. Doc, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to ask about your figuration of the non-human consciousness.
Raise your voice.
I wanted to ask about the non-human figuration of the consciousness, your figuration of it as inherently hostile. And I just wanted you to talk about that. I mean, it seems to me that Hume figures a similar kind of pre-reflective consciousness, but that's where he grounds intensive sympathy, the consciousness prior to the I. So I wondered why you would say that the non-humanity is inherently hostile.
Well, this was Merleau-Ponty's term, hostile, but I mean I would agree. So in so much as hostility, or as I write elsewhere, horror is the affective experience, the affective relationship that still holds between the human and the non-human as being torn apart or as dissolving in some respects. So, you know, the sort of idea of phenomenology of disintegration or hostility or horror, it's not for me a sort of aestheticized kind of phenomenology, but this the experience, the very experience of horror or of hostility has an importance in so much as it marks, you know, some rupture, some structural rupture, which can only be understood indirectly in terms of, you know, hostility. Obviously, it's not the case that hostility or something like this belongs to the thing itself, but just that this is this sort of mere kind of feeble attempt of the human subject to try and integrate something, and yet is met with resistance, and so therefore you have this, you know, affective experience.
Gina?
I wanted to ask you a question about, you kind of mentioned alien materiality, and I was just, because you have an interest in psychoanalysis, if you could ask me if you could push down in your direction to understand analysis. would it be something like the discourse of the other level or to map that terrain? And is the alien materiality anything to do with what Merleau-Ponty calls alien intentionality in the book language?
I hadn't thought of it in terms of what you say there about him speaking of this indivisible and invisible, but it's a good point. I need to think about it more, but thanks for that. I like that. No, as for psychoanalysis, certainly, because I mean, you know, in a way, I'm quite happy to align this account of alien materiality with the unconscious that sort of lets itself out despite oneself. You know, that there is a sort of a disclosure or rupture despite or precisely because one tries to conceal it or you know, adorn it with some sort of symbolic or egocentric value. And also, of course, because in some respects this idea of an alien materiality is precisely that which is met with a blind spot. It is, you know, it is not something that can be appropriated or apprehended or accessed except indirectly, except as a symptom. So I mean, for example, I mean a lot of work that I'm doing on another thing is about anxiety and phobia, and these two issues of alienage and materiality and, you know, various disorders, or, you know, blah blah blah, some sort of, you know, various psychoanalytic sort of syndromes are indeed closely related in terms of something coming to the surface which perhaps, you know, is otherwise repressed. And of course Merleau-Ponty talks a lot about this himself, as what he calls sort of organic repression, which I think he gets from Freud.
Francis, you're in your seat, just I can see you there.
I think it actually relates to both questions too. You attend to something you're interested in, not only excess matter, but also excess culture. There is an anteriority of the body which is to be recovered, and the prehistory of that. Is there also then a kind of a prehistory or an anteriority of the kind of the cultural within which the human would enter, which also exceeds them, which might also, maybe I'm speaking for myself now, which might also become excessive or horrifying as well. It's not reducible only to matter.
Oh no, well, I mean, of course, I mean, as Merleau-Ponty describes in one of these chapters in the Phenomenology of Perception, you know, we're born into an alien culture, in so much as we're born into things, this sort of, you know, object-orientated kind of stuff is already there in what he's describing in the Phenomenology of Perception, is so much as we're born into things that precede us, that have been cultivated, shaped, you know, blah blah blah, both by humans and by non-humans. So therefore, you know, there is this history that is manifest in a particular culture, which of course we don't have but no choice except to be born into, which cannot be fully comprehended or assimilated. And of course, one particular cultural manifestation of this would be language, you know, and you know, here you have a nice kind of linkage with Lacan, insofar as, you know, you're born as sort of brute matter, and then this is to some extent corrupted or rendered alien through this entrance into the symbolic realm, into the use of language, and so therefore, you know, you're lost. There is something that is lost and can never ever be integrated, you know, once you've kind of broached this threshold and somehow lost, you know, lost sight of this origin, of this pre-cultural, pre-symbolic origin. So, yeah, I mean, definitely, there's a big role play here, some sort of countervent.
Are they equal and opposite, or are they, is one taking priority here?
Well, I mean, I definitely believe in the primacy of the body as alien. This is like the absolute motivation here is to try and be true to the spirit of phenomenology, to return to things, to return to the origin, and to try and elicit exactly what that origin is without already in a way conceptualizing it or tying it down to some sort of experiential account. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm with Nietzsche in thinking that the body is a sort of a form of knowledge before anything else. Certainly.
I think there was a question over there.
Hi. You were talking at the beginning about the body as a science of convergence, and also maybe emphasizing the remnants of that experience. And I've recently been reading Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill, and then she talks about the body as a monster, and how it will eventually make us take it in this specific state. And I'm just wondering how you account for the traumatized body or the traumatized psyche within what you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for that. I suppose the traumatized body would give us some sort of condensed account of this relationship between an experience that is constitutive of a subject, but at the same time inaccessible. So, of course, in the idea of sort of traumatic memory or something, you have this subterranean, unconscious, bodily level of non-experience that is not manifest except as a symptom or as a trace. But at the same time, the very constitution, the very structure of the conscious subject is indeed dependent upon this inaccessibility, this limit. So I think it's definitely it's definitely a suitable parallel for what I'm trying to get at here. That some sort of traumatized materiality is indeed a nice counterpart to some sort of alien materiality.
Are you finished?
No. Oh yeah, I'll finish it.
Oh yeah, no. I actually just have one question, and I kind of just want to keep true to this our starting question that Michael has now described. We all asked, or just to relate it. Certainly with phenomenology as traditionally conceived in its traditional manner, it would very much say it's very kind of a Heideggerian inflected one, at least, would be having this notion of a totality or something like that, where and that for Heidegger, anyways, I understand him, guarantees the inexhaustible aspect. For you, it's and I suppose I should relate this to Nick's talk as well. He did give a talk, I suppose, by proxy. That element of inexhaustibility for someone like Heidegger and for a lot of phenomenology inclined people would be you have to have this totality, whereas for you is a different kind of that you can nearly find that in this breach aspect, this alien aspect instead, that you don't need to or does that still come in, this aspect of having a wider horizon upon which, or that I'm trying to get at that notion of the breach.
For example, of course, one of the things that could be applied from Heidegger to this discussion would, the sort of broken towards being some sort of privileged site of disclosure, and then you would have, the broken body of somehow being metaphysically privileged. And of course, you kind of have this in Heidegger already as an kind of anxiety, as a metaphysically privileged mood that discloses certain things that are otherwise concealed. But I think that it has its limits, because I want to try and move to somewhere where it's already constituted. It's already constitutive of a subject, rather than have delineating these privileged moments that are somehow rarefied and able to articulate something that is. It just doesn't seem to me terribly convincing to circumscribe certain sets of experience. Although, of course, I'm not saying that the experiential world is somehow homogeneous, and of course, to some extent, mood, the phenomenological idea of mood, it discloses things that are indeed otherwise concealed. But I guess I'm not entirely sure that that's a sort of ontology. It's like an existential analysis, but I don't know if you can really describe this in terms of a sort of ontology.
Certainly, though, there's an aspect that, if I got your talk correctly, it was that whereas most phenomenology kind of one would go for the whole overly consistent, really try making you mentioned disintegration and breach and these notions, which in some ways is at the same time you go in a completely different direction. But say with accelerationism, it's also thinking of those disintegrative forces that are at work, and hey, that's what we accelerate, hence the name. But certainly, this is, you said to me that this is the speculative realism thing is the best thing that's happened to phenomenology.
Sorry, what?
It's speculative realism is the best. You said it. We were drinking. But
I don't think I said that.
No, you said it because it gave a reason for it to exist again.
Didn't say that.
As in to fight, to take up arms again.
Well, phenomenology. I don't think it needs speculative realism.
No, it doesn't need it. But it's great because I shouldn't put words in your mouth.
But I'm pretty sure I didn't say it was the best thing.
No, maybe not the best. Maybe that was me embellishing it slightly. But certainly
it's helpful.
It's helpful. Was the thing, yeah.
It's helpful
because it throws light on.
Yeah, it's helpful.
These on your buzz.
But those problems, as far as I'm concerned, are already there.
Yes.
But they're already articulated in late Merleau-Ponty, for example. The whole correlation problem is there. It's already there.
I think sorry with this.
Yeah.
I think that's a big sort of issue as well with speculative realism. Is it sort of in some way unaware that this tradition sort of exists? Is unaware of the details of people like Merleau-Ponty, or people are so in some sense it's helpful, but there's a real lack of engagement within speculative realism with phenomenology as phenomenology is actually sort of practiced. Or in that sense, I think it's so your article on speculations kind of touches on this as well. So it's very important that I suppose it's very important. The onus really is on the speculative realist to engage phenomenology, not the other way around.
Levi-Bryant is great on that, because a lot of people will read him and say that we shouldn't abandon the whole what they're called anti-realists, but the whole point is saying why we shouldn't abandon them. So, Doctor,
I just wanted to say about that point, specifically building your work, the historical piece of the original art. The benefit of the speculative is it forces people like you, who are very intelligent in phenomenology, to prove that it has a speculative resonance, that it can speak in human ancestrality and these questions. And I think that Merleau-Ponty and late Heidegger do have the space to speak to this.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm sort of slightly hesitant of this idea that it somehow has to define itself. Yeah,
Okay. Thanks, Dylan.
Thanks a lot.
And
cheers.
Proxy. Thanks, Nick. Okay.
We're going to go straight into the next session.
Sorry.
Thanks, Dylan.
Cheers.
So next is Aaron Stapleton. Yeah, I'll share this. Who has had a fairly difficult journey here.
You go first, I need to sit up. Oh, okay. Are you okay to do
Do you want to sit down or do you want to talk up here?
I can move over.
I can
Maybe.
stand, but like, I guess that's kind of easier for everyone to get.
Okay.
Oh. Okay.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay, session 3, and welcome to Aaron Stapleton, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Budapest last May, and I'm really delighted to see her again. Aaron is a PhD student at Kingston University in London, where she's working with Scott Wilson, who'll be speaking here tomorrow. And her paper is entitled Divine or Sovereign Violence as Simulacrum, or if you want to take on the throne, you can't already be king.
Okay, hi. I just want to start by saying this is something that I'm kind of working through as an idea that I can, sorry, can't see you well if I've got my glasses on, as an idea that I can use for something. So my apologies if this is quite dry, but it's still in its kind of working through highly theoretical kind of stage, so bear with me. So in his essay, Critique of Violence, Walter Benjamin describes the decay of justice in state institutions as a cyclical and inevitable regression from an originary point of the violent establishment of law. In concluding this essay, Benjamin describes the terms thus: lawmaking violence is executive violence, so it moulds the community into a status quo, and which also, importantly, is termed mythic violence. Law-preserving violence is administrative, so it attempts to maintain and perpetuate the status quo. And so-called divine violence, which is an act of a monotheistic deity, that obliterates in a law-destroying act that supersedes human law. So it appears as though Benjamin's divine violence, which he also importantly terms sovereign violence, operates as a transcendent act of justice. So Benjamin's use of the term sovereign as a synonym for divinity in the final sentence of this essay betrays an alternative possibility for the act of violence itself. And I'm not going to go too much into the relationship between sovereignty and the divine here, but it's kind of an interesting side structure that I don't have time to kind of cover. But it's quietly indicative of the analogous structure of a divine identity shares with that which seeks to expose and destroy it. The implication being that there is the potentiality for a mystical or divine act of annihilation beyond the God figure that Benjamin had envisaged. In Carl Schmitt's essay, Political Theology, he locates the position of sovereignty in the right to decide the temporal and spatial location of a state of exception. When all so-called everyday rules are suspended, and therefore the power of the decision of the suspension of the entire, the power of the decision, quote, of the suspension of the entire existing order, end quote. The power of this decision, described by Schmitt as, quote, the monopoly to decide, is held by those whose position is perceived to be mandated by God. And it's kind of interesting as well if we think about the recent resignation of the Pope, and anyway, that was kind of a side thing that I was thinking, and it sort of screws up their sovereignty in a way. Anyway, so Schmitt's model of sovereignty remains reliant on its legitimization by both a perceived divine mandate and the dominant or so-called everyday socio-political order, and therefore cannot suspend that order without this mandate. It is a position that remains bound within the confines of Benjamin's description of law-preserving violence, and therefore, unlike Benjamin's divine or sovereign violence, does not expose, undermine, or annihilate the structures of human law that it remains reliant upon. This demonstrates the annihilating gesture of divine or sovereign violence must be theorized without a reliance upon or reference to a social or perceivably divine law per se. Sovereign violence must only be enacted not by those who already own the power, gods, popes, priests, kings, politicians. Did I break something
No,
then?
no.
Okay, cool. But by those whose rebellion against dominant and homogeneous social order is so complete that they expose the structure of its fabrication. In Georges Bataille's 1933 discussion of fascism, the psychological structure of fascism, he indirectly critiques Schmitt's argument by demonstrating that of the two types of the heterogeneous, where the heterogeneous is defined by being unable to be assimilated into a homogeneous social governance. The two types being of the king and of the outcast. The excluded is the only position from which one is able to be active, so the king's kind of passive and still within social order. As it is the only position that one is not reliant upon social homogeneity for anything, as one has nothing already. It is from this position that Bataille reconstructs the notion of sovereignty through those excluded from homogeneous social order. And I have a quote from the beginning of Madame Edouarda, where Bataille says, "Anguish only is sovereign absolute. The sovereign is a king no more. It dwells low, hiding in big cities. It knits itself up in silence, obscuring its sorrow. Crouching, thick-wrapped, there it waits, lies waiting for the advent of him who shall strike, a general terror. But meanwhile, and even so its sorrow scornfully mocks at all that comes to pass, at all there is." Quote. Bataille develops this argument in the third volume of The Accursed Share, where sovereignty is a position held by the heterogeneous outside the structures of political and social power, and Bataille demonstrates that sovereignty is most clearly experienced and enacted by those least bound to what we could consider law preservation. So criminals, blah, blah. It's also important to consider that the truly heterogeneous, those who are truly isolated from homogeneous social order, related to power structures, are to Bataille conceptual and fictitious. You can't always be completely outside the system. It doesn't work. Sovereignty for Bataille becomes an experiential, momentary glimpse at a world beyond the oppression of economic production, using the metaphor of the worker having his glass of wine at the end of the day. This conceptualized fiction is taken up by Kristeva as well as, others in Telkel Group, blah, as a way to position the sovereign as a fictional subject, with creative writing as its core. I'm not going to go into this further here for lack of time, but this is kind of what I'm interested in, because it's interesting how sovereignty kind of resonates as a device that penetrates that Kantian delineation between modes of inner and outer experience in writing. And yeah, that's particularly sort of kind of discussed in Nick Land's Thirst for Annihilation. But anyway, experience and practice become important when we consider the position also in relation to Deleuze's simulacrum. So in considering the structure of the establishing mythic or law-making violence and the repetition of the mythic principle in law-preserving violence, there is a close resemblance to Gilles Deleuze's description of the Platonic order of representation in his 1969 essay, Plato and the Simulacrum. In this essay, Deleuze describes the Platonic order as a hierarchy negotiated by rivalry between the establishing model and which is an originary point, and the repetition of that model in the copy. Deleuze establishes the terms of Platonic representation as being formed by the paradoxically circular and foundational process of myth-making. When considering Benjamin's description of violence, we can understand mythic violence to be analogous to the model, which establishes the law and law-preserving violence as the copy. The relationship between Deleuze's Platonism and Benjamin's structure of violence can be most clearly seen in Benjamin's description of the decay of justice in parliamentary proceedings and law courts. Benjamin describes a progressively impotent, law-preserving violence, each repetition of which draws proceedings away from the revolutionary force of the original, the mythic model. Consequently, due to the decay in power caused by this degrading repetition, mythic violence, which is bound to the notion of the general strike, must be periodically reenacted to return force to the structures of legal power. However, this process itself is obviously repetitive, and one which would closely align itself with a demonstration of the Deleuzian reading of Nietzsche's eternal return, which is also briefly alluded to in this essay as a process that the simulacrum cannot appear without. In Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle by Pierre Klossowski, he similarly expresses Nietzsche's eternal return as, quote, a combat against culture in the name of a culture of effects, possible only after a progressive dislocation of the substructures that are elaborated in language. This dislocation and destruction, in order to create, is caused by the simulacra that the eternal return produces, and this destruction of culture is enacted by the sovereign violence that these simulacra represent. As Deleuze is adamant that simulacra have creative potency, so does the law-destroying annihilation of sovereign violence. As Deleuze demonstrates, the concept that the model enacts and the copy repeats does not participate in the creation of meaning. The idea itself, which is the idea itself, as, quote, to participate is at best second rank. So, a violence that annihilates the order of lawmaking and law-preserving violence, while exposing the arbitrary nature of that violence, could not be associated with this markedly unparticipatory abstraction, the concept of justice, big J. This suggests that justice as a pre-originary and abstract concept, which Deleuze terms the idea, to which law-making and law-preserving violence as the practical participants are referring, cannot itself be enacted. So the sovereign cannot itself be enacted. However, when sovereign violence intervenes, it is prompted by the dirge-like degradation inherent in the repetition of relations between mythic and law-preserving violence, and seeks to undermine their power. Deleuze considers the simulacrum beyond the bad copy or false pretender of the more familiar Platonic characterizations, and instead, Deleuze emphasizes the creative potency of the term, which is contained in its seditious potential for the destruction of Platonism. The simulacrum undermines the relationship or rivalry between the model and copy, and in doing so shows the artificial nature of that relation as it, quote, places into question the very notations of copy and model, end quote. The simulacrum appears as a copy, but as it is disloyal to the intention of the model, if exposed, it destroys the veracity of both the copy and the model in their appearance. The degradation then that produces sovereign violence demands the sacrifice of any cohesive, legal or classifiable identity and position of those who enact it. Bataille's model of sovereign experience is reliant on the sacrifice of the self in the disruption of inner experience for the sake of sovereignty, and unintentionally the multiplicity such a sacrifice provides, and something that Klossowski takes up. As Deleuze describes in his essay, Klossowski or Body's Language, the differentiated first produces the fixed identity of God, and that identity is undermined by the rivalry of the reflective structure of the Antichrist as, quote, the system of the Antichrist is the system of simulacra opposed to the world of identities. So it's my contention then that divine or sovereign violence behaves as a simulacrum, and this is because the experience of sovereignty requires the dissolution of the cohesive self. So this means that it is in the opposition to the divine, the absolute stable identity, God and Pope, and the named, and is instead a form of possibly impossible rebellion, radical rebellion. Sovereign violence exposes the petty repetition and degradation of mythic violence by law-preserving forces, and as such uncovers the methodology of the system itself. The behaviour of sovereign violence is demonstrated by the Deleuzean simulacrum insofar as it is a usurping term that undermines the structural integrity that produces the status quo of legal violence. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Just take those and then do you sit down?
Oh yes, I'll just grab my pen.
Should I do this? Yeah, so I've got the slide. Thanks, sorry.
Just while Alice is setting up, it occurred to me there that we should mention, or at least register, the gender politics of this conference, because there's been a lot of criticism, as many of you will be aware, of the perceived masculinism or androcentrism of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. So one of the things which we endeavoured to bring about with weaponising speculation was some sort of gender equality when it came to the speakers that we had. So originally we did invite half and half, male and female speakers, but as it turned out, not everybody was available. But 10 female speakers out of 28, I think, is quite significant in terms of speculative realist events, which are mostly dude fests, as they've been called on the internet. Also,
How do I change slide when I want to change slide?
I want to mention again the exhibition which is going on at Block T, because 7 of our speakers today and tomorrow, John Ryan, Keir McMahon, Theresa Gillespie, Alice, who's about to speak, help me out, Alan Boardman, Rob Murphy, and have I missed anyone? Andy Weir, who unfortunately isn't here but has sent us a video, are all presenting their work at Block T, and we open at 8 p.m. tonight. So you're all invited to come to the exhibition as well, which is an accompaniment to the conference. Are you all set up?
Yes.
Great. So Alice Rekab, who I have to say is very important to me, not just as a friend, but in terms of bringing about Just. She won't be aware of this, but Just as in its attempts to bring about unlikely conversations between disparate groups of people, artists, theorists, philosophers, aestheticians, para-academics. Alice started that conversation because she contacted me in November 2011, I think, and since then all of the people who I've met and all of the artists who are involved in this event have largely been facilitated by that original introduction from Alice. So I'm very grateful for that. She is a visual artist living and working in Dublin and London. Completed an MA in Contemporary Art and Theory at Goldsmiths in 2011, following a BA in History of Art and Fine Art at NCAD in 2009. She's currently undertaking a PhD in the same place as Erin Stapleton, our previous speaker, at the London Graduate School in Kingston. Her work explores the effective dynamics between subjects and objects of attraction, examining the performative, the mimetic, the amateur, the viral, and the regional. And her most recent project, which you should all go see because it's still currently running, is Vector Attractor, which is at the Goethe Institute till sometime in April.
The 28th of March.
28th of March. And she is also showing in our exhibition Weaponising Speculation at Block T. Her paper today is entitled Objects, Actors and Sites of Contingency.
Okay, I'd like to say thanks to Michael, Paul and Fintan, and especially for that introduction that I did not expect. Okay, So yes, objects, actors, and sites of contingency. Okay, so this is the first step towards my PhD research. So this is a testing ground, which I'm quite excited about. Okay, so what I want to try and do here is to briefly interfere with or query the nature of my work as art, or maybe non-art, in the sense of an art that is aware of its own materiality, and the exclusions of what might be understood as the self-sufficiency of contemporary art, seen following Suhail Malik as a very specific movement in art's history, and one which can be charged with many of the same crimes contemporary philosophy faces at the hands of Francois Laruelle. That is, with self-proclaimed authority to represent the real by virtue of its exteriority to it, and indeed its disavowal of the effects of its apparatus of representation on those other objects and practices it often employs in service of its own agendas. Okay. It is perhaps true then there are also things that cannot be made into contemporary art, or perhaps standard contemporary art, but only form themselves through a flattened or equalized instance where art and its platforms and histories are themselves considered just another material or component for creative production and presentation of truths. In this written experiment, I want to propose a model based on the two-slits experiment, a fundament of quantum physics, whose concepts are put to use by a number of contemporary thinkers, including Karen Barrett and Francois Laruelle. Here I will propose a non-standard observation of my own arts practice, reworking some of my own and others' ideas on what that might be. Using Vector Attractor, one of my most recent projects mentioned by Michael and curated by Georgina Jackson, as an example, I will present elements of the exhibition as art objects, but also as actors that can potentially play the part of apparatus, referent, or indeed observer within the experimental situation that is the exhibition. The exhibition being an experiment in so much as it seeks to track or make visible in some measure a particular real phenomena, which is of interest to me, the artist. Okay. Phenomena understood according to Barrett's description as the entanglement, the ontological inseparability of interacting agencies, where agency is an enactment, not something someone has or something instantiated in the form of an individual agent. The show, which is the second manifestation of an ongoing collaborative exchange with a group called Stars Combine, a group of their comedians and performers from Sierra Leone. The exhibition displays a number of different media, including a film by Stars Combined, so I've screened that film alongside my own work. The exhibition presents a number of different approaches or vectors from the same referent or point of attraction. In this case, my point of attraction being the concept of an object of attraction that can form an aggregate or a community around it while appearing or identifying a different aspect of itself to each member of that community. So, in a sense, the exhibition is trying to enact the thing that it is attracted to. Okay? So the exhibition, which is composed of a sculpture, a banner, and 3 films, is an interaction between myself, the visual artist, a group of comedic performers, and the director Emma Drader, which seeks to materialize a number of interesting relationships which I observed and was a part of. These relationships were formed by components or materials of equivalent value, but perhaps of varying degrees of plain visibility, which, when interfaced within my own particular experiment, produced an array of observable results which constitute the works. Objects oriented towards some aspect of the real, some made up, some found, some composed purely of thought or language, and some activated remotely through planned and contingent performances, both human and non-human. I would like to present each component of the exhibition itself as an actor that can play the part of either referent apparatus or indeed observer within this experimental situation. I will hypothesize that it is through this exchangeability of roles or observable coincidences of agency and function that each can be read as equally material and contingent, both on the viewer and each other, and are thus all subject to a relational existence as aspects of the one real in which all practices of thought, art, politics are part of rather than external and transcendent to. Okay, so the first kind of heading of the talk is the idea of object as a referent, and this is in a sense the most common descriptive sense of an object. So this is object as a referent, an observer's description, a banner, 3 kinds of diamond, and 3 films. So an art object is most often considered the referent of an exhibition, the real phenomena to be observed and described, one that reacts to the observer in the sense that its behavior, or what it does, has the potential to occupy more than one state at any instance of observation, and potentially appearing differently to each observer. The art object is visible in physical space, but superposits multiple behaviors, meanings, or activities dependent on the observer, who is, in the words of Karen Barrett, part of the phenomenon. Yes? Okay. So the banner fills the gallery. It is 630 centimeters in length and 330 centimeters in width, and is broken into 3 parts. It's semi-transparent and backlit. It carries the image of the Bowtown Clock Tower, which is a meeting point in Sierra Leone's second city, Bow, and the birthplace of Stars Combine. And an example of those poured concrete edifices that have come to represent 60s African progress. It is a portable location, a backdrop, a stage set, and a flag, a thing that people can get behind, and a thing that draws them together, a site for gathering. It is weatherproof, it is cloth standing in for concrete, and a tarmac space, and the title piece of the show, Vector Attractor. Suspended in the air between 2 columns, behind the banner is the first diamond, cut into a trapezoid and made of foam. This object is flecked with colours, reconstituted from other bits of foam, other objects. It is a material component of furnishings and upholstery. It is considered the highest quality available due to the fact that because it is bound together or reconstituted with glue and odd-shaped offcuts, it keeps its shape for longer, and coincidentally makes up something that looks like static on a screen, cut marble, a loudspeaker, or a pink, blue, white, black, and yellow flecked kind of diamond. The diamond is visible through the fabric of the banner and can also be viewed directly from the side. This diamond acts as an artwork in the way that an artwork should. The object performs its associated meanings in the space. The second diamond is on screen, part of Mumu Language, a comedy filmed in Sierra Leone by Ahmed Rader, and is part of the film which I screened. Okay, so the stone in this case is hyperbolic and large. It is another fake, but one that performs the role of a real stone in a sketch depicting 2 men. Performer is Saidu Temperature, who's not in shot, that's his hand, and Momo Ranka, who is in shot, and a Lebanese merchant who remains nameless. The diamond is the subject of a conversation, a trade, and a joke. Its surface is shining and it is semi-transparent, probably plastic, possibly glass. It comes wrapped in a tissue carried by Momo, who speaks a language that only temperature can interpret. This diamond acts as currency and performs alongside its human counterparts in a film that does not consider itself contemporary art, but rather a satirical commentary on the casual trade of alluvial diamonds in Sierra Leone and the relationship between trade, language, and interpretation. An observation is provided in subtitles. The second film is another form of performance. The human actor is now replaced with a non-human actor. Oh, sorry, I skipped a paragraph. The second, there we go. Okay, the second film continues on this theme. It is a music video that recounts the adventures of Momo as translated by Saidu in different locations in Bowtown, with the presence of a certain religious commentary animated through gesture, humorous dancing, and costume. Okay, so those are just a few stills from the film. Okay. This film animates through various iterations the idea of what Mumu language is. what it stands for, maybe. The third film is another form of performance. The human actors are now replaced with a non-human or inhuman actor. The third diamond stands in the locations of the original Mumu film, replacing their performance, the human performance, with a performance of its own strangeness in the environment and the contingency of the film's production. So this diamond was sent in a flat pack with Emad to Botan by me, with very little instruction except to take it to where the film was shot and to film it as he wanted. And I had no idea that I would get this film until about a week before the show opened, so it's a bit hairy, but also maybe the exciting part. Okay, where am I now? Performance of its own strangeness and the contingency of the film's production. Yes, and I presented this alongside the other film basically I screened it alongside the original film with subtitles, and yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the bit we're used to hearing about an artist's talk, describing the artworks, kind of contextualize them as I saw them and how they acted. And now I'm trying to turn towards a slightly more experimental part of this paper, which is the notion of an object acting as an observer. So we've seen the object as a referent, which is quite a common position for an object, but the object as an observer. What does an object observe? In a sense, we cannot know this. Its observation is not accessible to us naturally, but what is accessible to us is perhaps the influence of its observation on the behavior of its reference. In a sense, to return to the idea of the two slits experiment, one of the things that was kind of discovered in this experiment was that the presence of an observer, an observational apparatus, actually affects the behavior of the referent. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. So we can't register the observation of a thing that is not naturally accessible to us. Perhaps we can observe the impact that its observation has on its surroundings. Anything else would be speculation. So yes, its relationship to the thoughts that it refers to the idea or the concept it relates to in its encounter, and how it fuses with the influences and influences the material level of the apparatus, i.e. the film, digital information, sculpture, foam, nylon, and the artist's own body, or perhaps the gallery itself. We could speculate that the film's referent is what it observes, the concept of illicit trade of diamonds, its apparatus, both the camera and the performers, including the fake diamond and us. The film as an observer, in turn, affects the behavior of these measurable and visible components, affects the actor's behavior, the mechanism of the camera, and the meaning of the fake diamond. The result is what we in turn might observe as the experience of the exhibition. This hypothesis makes the demand that we see the film as equally thinking or capable of producing thought, and not simply an extension or tool of the artist. Okay, so we've had the art object as a referent, an experiment with the art object as an observer, and now the possibility, and perhaps easier to kind of condense the art object as an apparatus. So for the viewer or the audience who takes the concept or the thought as reference, the art object becomes that apparatus which we look through to gain a partial measurement of the matter or material of thought that make up its display. In a sense, a platform for aspects of the real that might not otherwise be visible. And it is perhaps through this particular function that the settings of the apparatus, its agency, its stance, or the particularity of its view of the real phenomena is most visible, and thus enables us to envision or indeed imagine the multiple and superposited potential variants that could be made visible, but are not, by virtue of the partiality of both the apparatus and the observer herself, i.e. the particularity of the film's content, the particularity of the sculpture's shape, its materials and its position in the gallery, the particularity of the image on the banner, the place it presents, and its connection to the other work, all indicate that these art objects are set from a particular stance, and that the stance is part of the complex interaction of materials. Okay, in conclusion to this brief experiment, it is clear to me at least that the art object can be seen to perform many roles, often simultaneously, in the experiment of an exhibition. Being observed, observing, and being used to observe in any single encounter. And while following Karen Barrett, there are bodies which define the experimental conditions and which embody particular concepts to the exclusion of others, that those bodies of thought, art, foam, film, thought itself, performance, cloth, and song, are of equal but differential value, and exchange those values freely with one another as part of one common real. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alice. Does anybody have any comments or questions for either Aaron or Alice? We have a few minutes. Yep.
Well, at the moment, I'm looking at Kasama's sort of self-obliteration project, which to me kind of culminated in her very sort of public self-obliteration suicide event of being on top of Selfridges and repeating herself in that kind of project with Louis Vuitton. It's like she sacrificed herself to undermine capitalism in this really kind of interesting way. But I'm just kind of starting to work through that. But it's that kind of gesture that I guess I'm really interested in, that kind of that, because she is in a sort of Foucauldian sense of the outside, and she's lived in a mental institution most of her life and all that sort of thing, and she's very marginalised for lots of reasons. I think that's a really interesting thing to then kind of begin self-obliteration in the 60s and end it with Louis Vuitton. So anyway, but as I said, I just started to kind of look at that. That's where I'm going with it. Thank you.
Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you. When you were dealing with it earlier. Well, when we were dealing with Dylan, it didn't really bring up a lot of the things for Nick, but I think that Aaron in your talk kind of touched on a lot of these issues in the time frame. Kind of locating the freedom in the Kantian, moment of rational self-legislation, whether or not that's an authentic form of freedom. And I thought it was not unrelated to your having sent the diamond off, just to be in the world and do its kind of own things. I just wanted to kind of, hear your guys' thoughts on that.
Well, we planned the whole thing.
Well, I had read Aaron's paper, and firstly because I hadn't thought of what I was going to do till quite late. But it wasn't like consciously to connect it.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add to that is, I mean, yeah, I'm really interested at the moment as well in that kind of distinction between the inner and outer of experience, and also in that the sovereign experience, which is the excessive experience, penetrates that border. I really like that kind of dissolution of that border that you know, Bataille sort of approaches in his description of it. So yeah, again, that's sort of what I'm trying to get out of it.
Yeah, I suppose it's more a sort of a change in perspective rather than a dissolution of the border for me, where it's not so much that the formality of our presentation will be in any way different necessarily, but that it is aware of itself within a more egalitarian or flat ontology, to use Laruelle and John Will-Atkins language. And that in a sense it's the orientation of an artefactus that I'm interested in, and through it changing its orientation, I believe inevitably its outward appearance will also change, but that the shift is one that happens in a sense, in a gesture first, and then from that gesture different things will develop. I suppose that's what I'm going.
You know, like a lot of people, I love that story of you know, Schumann when he's asked to explicate on the meaning of a piece, he plays the piece again. But you know, when an artist writes about a work, you know, particularly in kind of experimental way in Europe, you know, I just wonder whether, I mean, you have a sense of which piece of work is given priority. You know, and so I'm wondering for you about the difference in status between the exhibited work and the writing that you're doing about them. I mean, how do they play against one another, or how do you think about that?
Well, I don't see them as, there's no status difference for me. They're two, like, what I call parallel practices, that inform one another but don't necessarily touch. I mean, this is the first time I've actually tried to make them touch to a certain extent. Yeah, I don't, certainly for myself, I don't see one as, or I would even go as far to say as I would rally against the idea that one would take a position of authority over the other. So you could say that because this is a conference where the delivery of papers is the primary form of communication, so I've chosen the language of thought or philosophy to communicate the ideas. And I would argue then that the exhibition, which has a kind of a minimal text component, uses the domain of the visual to argue or present its own perspective on same real or topic or aspect of the real that I am looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't know where this would go, but I mean, it's interesting to me that at the moment, in this moment in kind of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, a lot of the kind of, any metaphors that are drawn from science seem to be drawn from physics.
Yeah.
But you know, at the same time, I'm hearing kind of even in the way that you're responding to my question, you know, kind of like an ecological thought,
yeah.
if you like. I mean, there's the question of the maybe symbiotic relationship between the written word and art, or maybe there's a type of parasitism, or you know, you can call it para-academic, like all of these things. So it just strikes me kind of that there's a lot of different practices swirling around, and it's kind of interesting to think about the relationship between forms.
I think
is why I enjoyed it so much.
I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I think that ecology is definitely another very, it's a thing I don't know that much about, I suppose, but certainly around kind of these sort of nodes of work around Laruelle's work. Anthony Paul-Smith, who was here a couple of weeks ago, would have written quite extensively and have a much more kind of, I suppose, in-depth understanding and representation of that kind of work. But yeah, there's definitely room for that understanding, but I think it is always going to be, yeah, I suppose, I think Yeah, it depends on your perspective, I suppose, of what road you choose into that particular idea.
There will be quite a few papers on ecology, I think, over the next couple of days too. It's been very pleasant that I think all of the papers this morning have been like sort of testing ground for ideas or experiments. I mean, you explicitly said that, Alice, but also Aaron, trying out ideas. I think that's important. That the subject's supposed to know at conferences is supposed to come up and give something which is already pretty well formulated. But this conference has a different kind of animating spirit, I think. We're going to break for lunch now for an hour. Unfortunately, our budget doesn't run to paying for lunch for people. I wish it did. But there are lots of places, cafes and so on the street and streets near here. So if you're not from Dublin, just latch on to someone who is and parasite on them. We will start back at 2 p.m. with session 4.
I know, well that's actually a related one.
That's hilarious.
What? It's from Dublin. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. No, that's cool. Yeah, he would have been so happy to hear you saying that.
That was awesome.
I'm so nervous. Yeah, I'm delighted.
I'd love to come see the thing. Where is it? I'm here for the next 2 days. It would be good.
Hi. I'm nervous. I think it was good though. It worked actually.
Yeah, it's like everywhere you.
I know. I just going to get my memory sticky.
Yes.
I was going to use the candle crisp, but I bottled out because I was afraid. Yeah, because it does this thing sometimes where you don't change the page.
It's something for like non-professional acceleration
or else
thing. It's like this, like, freedom is legislation, and it just kind of like grates on me. And so your paper kind of formulated.
If I sit down or if I'm over there, that make this.
You can either. I don't know why.
I wouldn't go about you really mess it up like every song like season.
Very good.
Yeah, I know.
I feel like this is the beginning of a don't do what Johnny Don't does video, where you're gonna get electrocuted.
I'm actually
you're gonna learn valuable lessons.
This is going out live on the internet. Me trying to remove the light.
Untimely demise following electrocution.
Hey, thanks.
You know, I'm thinking of doing that for my talk, so getting up there and taking the full thing.
Well, I don't know how to take it out. I'm also not sure if I could.
You take it out, it's like friendly.
Which one?
I don't want. There'll be nothing supporting it then.
Just missed the pointer. I was trying to like
Yeah, you know Yayo Kisama? She's an artist who She actually institutionalized herself in, I think it was the early 70s after spending the 60s in New York and being, passed around by art.
No, you're like,
she sort of rarely, but she has like an art practice that's across the road from.
That's
Yeah, she's I mean, she's her latest collaboration with oh, yeah.
brilliant. Thanks. Sorry.
Are you just taking it out, or? Yeah, just take the fuse out.
Oh, take the
Fuse out.
No, that wasn't the fuse. That was just because I got
The fuse has to fuse. So don't try and remove the thing, Michael.
we did.
You just did. You just knocked it out.
See, I've been electrocuted. It's not fun.
Yeah, watch.
No, you should be able to get the fuse.
I can't work out which one is the fuse.
Yeah.
All right. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, just leave it. Just leave it.
Just play. Yeah, see what we
Take
take.
this out.
It's great. We're really starting to hack the building now.
That's load better.
Oh yeah.
Like it makes such a difference. Where does this?
It's really just. I mean, the actual the projector itself is fine. Like that's but it's the feed for the one for the hand. Sorry, the print. What's that called?